Sparta, 485 years before Christ. Theana had been taught since childhood that a Spartan woman's worth was measured by the strength of the sons she gave to the city. But when her newborn arrived, small, trembling, and far too quiet, the midwives exchanged a single bleak glance that told her everything. In Sparta, weakness was not misfortune, it was offense, and before the sun set, men older than stone would decide whether her child belonged to the polis or to the shadows. Theana held him close, already feeling the judgment tightening around her throat. The storm rolled over Tegetos like a warning, low thunder crawling across the mountains as Theana labored on a reed-woven mat inside her small stone home. Sweat ran down her spine in burning trails while the midwives murmured prayers to steady their own nerves. When the child finally slipped into the world, the room fell silent. He was light as air, his breaths faint, his fingers curled like autumn leaves left too long in the sun. One midwife pressed her lips together, the other looked toward the doorway as if expecting the ephors to materialize on the threshold. Theana reached for her son, cradling him against her chest, feeling the flutter of his heart like a trapped bird. She whispered his name, Lysandros, though she knew better than to speak it aloud before the elders approved him. In Sparta, names were not gifts, but verdicts. Her husband, Ariston, stepped into the room, the storm wind following him like an omen. His face tightened the instant he saw the child's fragile frame, and he stopped short of touching him. Theana felt her stomach hollow at the sight. Strength meant honor, weakness meant disgrace, and disgrace spread like disease. The midwives cleaned the boy with trembling hands, their movements brisk, spare, and resigned. One leaned close to Theana and whispered that the Gerousia must see him before the next morning. The elders of the tribe would gather at the apothete, the rocky place of judgment, to determine if the boy was fit to live as a son of Sparta. There were no appeals. The city's law was older than memory, older than mercy. Theana looked down at the tiny face pressed against her arm. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, dark and soft, unaware of the weight already placed on his existence. She felt a sudden rush of defiance, a fierce instinct that surpassed any loyalty she owed the polis. She wished she could hide him, flee with him, vanish into the mountains, but even the thought felt foolish. No Spartan woman had ever escaped the reach of the elders. Outside, the storm gathered strength, rain beginning to strike the earth in sharp, cold sheets. Ariston paced the edge of the room, jaw clenched, refusing to meet her gaze. She understood what he was thinking, because she was thinking it too. A strong son elevated a household, but a weak one destroyed it. By the time the midwives wrapped the child in wool and prepared Theana for the walk to the elders, the storm had passed. The night air was unnaturally still, as if Sparta itself were holding its breath. Theana rose on shaking legs, clutching her fragile son, knowing that with each step toward the apothete she was carrying him closer to a verdict neither of them could escape. The path to the apothete wound upward along the stony ridge like a scar carved into the earth, and Theana felt every uneven step press through her sandals and into her bones. Dawn had barely begun to rise, staining the sky with a pale, indifferent light as she carried her swaddled child close to her chest. Ariston walked ahead of them, his back straight, his silence heavier than the morning air. He did not offer to take the child from her. He did not look back once. The elders disliked displays of softness, and his reputation could not afford even a whisper of pity. Theana kept her eyes on the ground, not daring to look at the other women they passed in the dim streets. Some watched her through half-open shutters, already guessing the truth from the hurried pace and the tightness of her embrace. A mother who bore a weak son carried a kind of shadow around her, and Sparta had no love for shadows. The climb grew steeper, and Theana's legs trembled with the strain. The child stirred faintly, a thin breath escaping his lips, barely a sound. She held him tighter, wishing she could shield him from the cold that seeped into his skin. At the ridge, the apothete emerged from the mist, a rocky enclosure overlooking a deep ravine. It was a place of decisions, not executions, but the name alone carried centuries of dread. The elders of the Gerousia were already assembled, standing or leaning upon their staffs, wrapped in woolen cloaks despite the warming air. They were men shaped by decades of discipline, their faces furrowed like weathered stone, their eyes empty of sentiment. One of the ephors raised a hand, signaling Ariston to step aside. Theana felt the withdrawal like a blade. She was alone now, alone before the men who would judge not her child but her worth. She sank to her knees, holding out the bundle of wool and fragile bones. The eldest of the council stepped forward, his breath slow and steady. He unwrapped the child with practiced movements, revealing the tiny limbs, the thin chest, the trembling pulse beneath translucent skin. The child made a faint, broken sound. It echoed against the stone like an accusation. The elder placed 2 fingers against the boy's sternum, waiting, measuring. Another elder leaned closer, muttering about the weakness of his cry. A third shook his head before the examination was even finished. Their voices blended into a single cold verdict: unfit for the city, unworthy of the agoge, a life that would not serve Sparta. Theana felt the world tilt beneath her. She reached instinctively for her son, but the elder's staff blocked her hand. She was permitted only one final glance. The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, searching. She whispered his name inside her mind, because she dared not speak it. No rejected child could carry a name. The elders wrapped the infant again and handed him off to a waiting attendant, a young man hardened to this ritual. Without looking at her, he turned away, disappearing behind the enclosure's inner wall, where mothers were never allowed to follow. Theana's breath broke in her chest. Ariston stood rigid, face blank, refusing to meet her gaze. When the ephor dismissed them with a flick of his hand, it felt less like an ending than an erasure. Theana rose slowly, her arms suddenly empty, the weight of her child replaced by a hollow that felt far heavier than anything she had carried up that mountain. When Theana returned to the city, the sun was already high, its heat pressing down upon her like a judgment she could not escape. Word of the elder's decision had outrun her steps, carried through whispered conversations in the agora, and woven into the sharp glances of passing women. Sparta was a small city with a vast memory, and nothing spread faster than the scent of weakness. As she walked through the streets, women paused in their tasks to watch her with the kind of measured curiosity that cut deeper than open cruelty. One older woman, broad-shouldered and proud, murmured to her companion that Sparta needed mothers of iron, not mothers of clay. Another shook her head and said Theana's household had been weakened by the gods long before the child was born, as if flaw were a lineage rather than fate. Though no one spoke directly to her, each half-heard remark landed like a stone upon her chest. Her husband kept several steps ahead, moving quickly as though hoping the distance between them might undo the shame that had settled over their home. Theana wanted to call out to him, to ask if he felt even a flicker of grief, but his rigid posture told her all she needed to know. A strong son raised a man standing, while a weak one diminished it. Her failure had become his, and he could not bear the weight of it. When they reached their courtyard, the servants lowered their eyes, unsure whether to greet her or avoid her entirely. She walked past them in silence and entered the small room where she had labored only hours before. The scent of herbs and linen still clung to the air, mocking her with memories of the fragile hope she had held for such a short time. She sank onto the stool beside the cold hearth and pressed her hands together to keep them from shaking. A neighbor entered without knocking, carrying an empty woolen blanket folded with ceremonial precision. It was a symbol Sparta had used for generations, a silent token of acknowledgement given to any woman who had brought forth a son deemed unfit for the city. No words accompanied the gesture. None were needed. Theana accepted the blanket, its weight unbearably light, and placed it across her knees. The neighbor left as quickly as she had come. As the afternoon faded into evening, Theana was summoned to join the women's procession for the monthly observance dedicated to honoring Spartan motherhood. She did not want to go, but refusal would only deepen the stain upon her name. She dressed herself carefully, smoothing the folds of her chiton with trembling fingers, and carried the symbolic empty blanket as the ritual demanded. The other women filed into formation, each holding their own symbols of strength or loss, but the eyes that slid toward her were sharp with judgment. As the procession wound through the city, voices rose in praise of mothers who had given Sparta warriors. but the words felt like thorns pressed against her skin. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, refusing to let the tears gather behind her eyes. By the time the ceremony ended, she felt hollow, as if the city had reached inside her and taken whatever remnants of pride or belonging she still possessed. Walking back through the darkening streets, she realized that from this day forward, she would not be remembered as Theana, daughter of respectable parents, wife of a disciplined Spartan man. She would be remembered only as the woman who had given Sparta a son too weak to bear its name. The days that followed unfolded with a silence so thick it pressed against Theana's ribs every time she tried to breathe. Sparta did not exile her in body, but it erased her in every other way that mattered. Women who once greeted her with brisk nods and firm handclasps now walked past as though she were carved from shadow. At the communal meals, where families gathered under the strict gaze of tradition, no one spoke to her unless custom demanded it, and even then the words were pared down to the barest necessities, sharp and dry as flint. She sat at the edge of the benches, hands folded tightly in her lap, listening to the hum of conversation that flowed around her without ever touching her. When she returned home each evening, the quiet inside the walls felt even heavier. Ariston kept to the far side of their shared space, speaking little, rising early, returning late. His duties had not changed, but his presence had. The shame of a weak son clung to him like smoke, and though he did not blame her aloud, blame hung between them like an unspoken oath. At night, Theana would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the empty blanket folded beside her like a ghost that refused to leave. She imagined the small weight that should have warmed her arm, the soft breath she should have felt against her skin. The absence hollowed her until she felt more like an echo than a living woman. She tried once to speak to Ariston, to ask if he missed the child even a little, but he simply tightened his jaw and told her that a Spartan must forget what weakens him. The words were not cruel, only rigid, shaped by a lifetime of laws that left no room for grief. Even so, they cut her more deeply than if he had shouted. Outside, the city continued its rhythm without her. She passed the women's training grounds where mothers watched their daughters throw javelins and run beneath the sun, their laughter clear and sharp. Those same women turned away from her presence, as though her misfortune could stain their households through mere proximity. Theana forced herself to keep walking, each step a reminder of the life she once believed she belonged to. There were moments when she felt her isolation most sharply, such as at the spring where the women filled their jars. She approached with her clay vessel, and the quiet rippled through the group as they stepped aside, not out of courtesy but avoidance. She lowered her jar into the cool water, watching it fill slowly, wishing she could vanish beneath its surface. Each night, she lit a small oil lamp in the corner of her home, a private ritual she dared not explain to anyone. She would sit beside it, the dim flame flickering across her face, and whisper a wordless hope that somewhere beyond the city's laws, her son's brief existence had not simply dissolved into nothing. Sparta demanded that she forget, but remembering was all she had left. It was the only rebellion she could carry in a city that claimed every breath she took. The summons arrived at dawn, carried by a young attendant whose expression was as unreadable as polished bronze. He spoke Theana's name in a firm, practiced tone, and informed her that the ephors required her presence at the council chamber before the morning meal. Her stomach tightened. Such summonses were rarely given to women unless their bodies, their marriages, or their usefulness to the city were in question. She wrapped her himation around her shoulders and followed the attendant through the cold streets, the sky still a dark blue bruise above the rooftops. As she walked, she felt the eyes of early risers slide toward her, not with sympathy, but calculation. In Sparta, a woman was valued for the strength she returned to the polis, and Theana had given it weakness. Now the state had come to collect what she still owed. Inside the chamber, the ephors stood like sentinels carved from the mountain itself. Their faces revealed nothing, their discipline sharper than any spear. One of them gestured for her to step forward, and she obeyed, keeping her gaze lowered. He spoke of her duty, of the expectation placed upon every Spartan woman to give the city sons who would one day enter the agoge, sons who would fight, endure, and strengthen the walls of Sparta with their endurance. He reminded her that her first child had not met that standard. His words were clinical, not cruel, yet each one carried the weight of a verdict. Theana remained silent, knowing anything she said could be misinterpreted as defiance. The ephor continued, explaining that a woman who failed to provide the polis with a strong son was expected to redeem herself swiftly. Sparta did not indulge mourning, nor did it honor grief. Instead, it demanded correction. Theana's hands tightened around her cloak as the ephor spoke of restoring her household standing, of ensuring her husband's line did not fade into disgrace, of fulfilling the role that Spartan law required of her. She understood what he was telling her. She must conceive another child as soon as possible, not out of love or longing, but for the city. She nodded slowly, the gesture small yet binding. It was not permission she offered, but submission to a duty she had never been allowed to escape. Then, as custom dictated, she was led to the sanctuary for the fertility blessing. It was not a gentle ritual. Spartan rites were stark, stripped of tenderness, leaving only the cold authority of necessity. The priestess marked her forehead with oil, invoked the strength of Spartan mothers who had birthed warriors, and commanded her body to serve the city with greater vigor. Theana kept her eyes open throughout, refusing to let the ceremony swallow her voice, though she spoke no words aloud. When it ended, she stepped outside into the midday glare, feeling both smaller and heavier, as though the city had set new shackles upon her shoulders. That night, Ariston did not speak when she entered their home. He did not need to. His posture, rigid and obedient to the council's expectations, told her that he understood the ephor's decision as clearly as she did. Their grief was not theirs to keep, and their bodies were not theirs to govern. Sparta demanded another chance, and she was expected to give it. Theana lay awake long after Ariston's breathing had settled into a steady rhythm. She rested a hand against her abdomen, not in hope but in resignation. The city had claimed her once again, and she could only obey. Theana felt the first signs of new life weeks before she dared to acknowledge them. A faint heaviness in her limbs, a quiet bloom of warmth beneath her ribs. She moved through the days with careful steps, aware that every woman in the city watched her with the same sharp interest they reserved for a spear being forged. A Spartan mother did not exist for herself. She existed for the polis, and now the polis waited to see whether Theana's body would redeem its earlier disappointment. Ariston walked beside her when required, but he no longer looked at her as a partner. He regarded her instead as a vessel entrusted with the future of their household, a vessel that had cracked once and was expected to prove its strength by holding steady now. She felt his distance like a second shadow, trailing her through every corridor and courtyard. By the 4th month, whispers followed her footsteps. Some women murmured that the gods had given her another chance, though they said it with a tone that implied the gods were reluctant. Others speculated that she had been blessed out of pity, a suggestion more humiliating than any open insult. Theana kept her head high, her hands folded over the small rise of her belly, refusing to let them see her falter. Yet, in the privacy of her home, she pressed her palm against her abdomen with both dread and longing. She remembered the fragile weight of her first son, the way his breath had fluttered like a bird trapped beneath her skin. She had not spoken his name in months, but it lived inside her like a quiet ember that refused to die. As her pregnancy advanced, the city's attention sharpened. Each morning, the women in the square watched her with narrowed eyes, evaluating her posture, her energy, even the fullness of her cheeks. Sparta believed a strong mother produced a strong child, and any sign of frailty in her would be interpreted as a flaw in the life she carried. Theana felt the pressure coil around her spine like a tightening rope. When the day of birth finally arrived, the summer heat pressed heavily against the walls of her home. She labored without a cry, her jaw clenched, determined not to show weakness even in this moment when pain tore through her in relentless waves. The midwives worked with focused efficiency, their expressions unreadable, as though they feared any hint of hope might bring misfortune. When the child came, he filled the air with a fierce, steady wail that vibrated through the room like a war cry. Theana sagged with relief, tears blurring her vision as she saw the robust weight of his limbs, the strong rise and fall of his chest. The midwives exchanged glances not of pity but of quiet approval, Ariston stepped forward at last, laying a tentative hand on the child's shoulder, pride flickering in his eyes for the first time in many months. But as Theana gazed at her newborn son, the sound of his cry echoing through the chamber, her heart twisted with a silent truth she dared not speak. Strength would save him. Strength had saved her, yet woven beneath her relief was a grief that would never loosen its hold. She would never forget the child who had been taken from her, the tiny life Sparta had deemed unworthy of its name. That memory, forbidden but fiercely kept, was her only rebellion. Days later, when she stood once more near the rocky heights of the apothete for the ceremonial inspection, she held her new son with steady arms. The elders nodded with satisfied approval, their faces stern but accepting. Theana looked past them to the endless horizon. She whispered a silent promise into the wind, a vow carried only by the mountains surrounding her. She would remember both sons, the one Sparta claimed and the one it cast away. And in a city where memory itself could be treason, holding on to that truth made her stronger than Sparta ever intended her to be.